In the 18th of March 2012, a 61-year-old man left a store at Kortedala Torg in Gothenburg. He met a group of 7 young men who'd been harassing his dog while he was inside. All of the teenagers were in the age group of 15 to 17. They'd been throwing things at the dog and they'd been trying to scare him. The man naturally got pissed off and told them to stop. After being ignored and laughed at, he walked up to the gang and continued yelling at them. One of the teenagers then punched the man, and they grabbed onto each other's clothing, and both of them fell backwards into a dried up fountain in the center of the square. What followed is one of the most brutal and savage beatings I've ever heard of. Several of these guys began kicking and beating the man while he was lying on the ground and was being unable to defend himself. All of the witnesses to the attack said that they saw a black man, from Somalia it later turned out, who jumped into the fountain and yelled at the teenagers to stop. In his testimony, he said that he was trying to shield the man on the ground from their kicks, but that they just kept kicking and didn't listen to him when he told them to stop. The man also said that those involved in the attack were about 6 or 7 young men, but that it was hard for him to tell. But despite this man's very courageous intervention, the attack continued. One of the assailants jumped full force on the man's head and partly crushed his skull. A kick to his face shattered the comparatively weak bones in the back of his left eye socket, and today he's blind on that eye. And they continued to relentlessly kick the man in the head even after he'd become unconscious. So after one of the teenagers had delivered one last kick with full force to this now unconscious man's face, the gang then left him as he lay dying on the ground.
För det så tänker de väl att då är det bäst att sticka, så att då var de på väg att rusa allihop på en gång. Och när de andra har kommit över fontänen, och det hade inte den sista killen gjort, då vänder han sig om och så går han in och så lägger han in en rejäl spark i huvudet, sen sticker han.
When he was later sent to a hospital, a doctor there said that was the most brutal case of a beating he'd ever seen, and it was like the man's head had been kicked around like a football. The man lay in a coma for 2 months, and when he woke up, he couldn't remember anything at all about the attack. In fact, he couldn't remember anything from the last 3 years of his life. In addition to the amnesia he now suffers from due to the damage he received to his head, the man now also has a very severe and permanent speech impediment, and problem using his arms and legs, and feels extremely weak when trying to lift things. His jaw got shattered during the beating, and he also lost several teeth. The 7 assailants got during the trial reduced to only 2, but the prosecutor stated that he was completely convinced that there had been more than 2 guys involved in the beating, but he was claimed to lack the evidence to prove it. Even an eyewitness account apparently wasn't good enough for the court. Not a single one of the 5 teenagers that were released did anything at all to help the man. The prosecutor did in fact argue this point, but it was mainly ignored. But let's anyway take a look at the quick definition of what it means to be convicted of being an accessory to a crime. To be convicted of an accessory charge, the accused must generally be proven to have actual knowledge that a crime was going to be or had been committed. Furthermore, there must be proof that the accessory knew that his or her action or inaction was helping the criminals commit the crime. Perhaps the court thought that these so-called innocent teenagers' inaction in stopping the brutal beating of a defenseless person was a mere case of semantics in regard of correctly interpreting the law. I mean, if you see your friend jumping on someone's head and kicking them in the face while they're unconscious, you might still not be convinced that a crime is being committed, right? Well, in fact, that was just the case being argued. And listen to this shit. 2 of the teenagers who were in this gang were being suspected of almost beating a man to death, and were therefore held in custody for 2 weeks, were paid together a sum of $8,498 for their suffering, and having to stay in custody without being properly charged. The reason they got paid this lesser fortune is because young people apparently suffer more from being incarcerated, and oh, cry me a river for fuck's sake. After reimbursing these punks little sob fest, the man who got beaten half to death later got the $18,500 he was supposed to receive in damages reduced to only $15,300. This is close to the same amount the 2 fuck-ups received for just sitting on their asses while being slightly uncomfortable for 2 weeks. The reason that the sum they were supposed to pay the man in damages was reduced was because they were young and the amount of money was deemed to be unfair for them to pay. The 2 teens that had done the most damage during the beating, they were sentenced to ungdomstjänst. It's similar to a youth rehabilitation order that they have in the UK, but it has less demands and it's for a shorter period of time. Ungdomstjänst means that you're forced to work without pay for 3 hours a day, twice a week, and to take part in group conversations about crime and how you can change your life in order to not commit new crimes. But it's not only about holding hands and hugging while talking about your feelings and how your father never loved you. Of course not. You also need to be on time for the meetings, take care of your schoolwork, and not commit any new further offenses. Basically, if you don't act like a dumbass and you work for free twice, 3 hours a week, that's pretty much your sentence. That's your sentence for giving another human being permanent brain injuries for the rest of his life. Because Sweden, because fuck logic. The two main convicts also at first didn't even receive the maximum amount of hours on their already ridiculous sentences. They only got 70 hours out of a max of 150, but after a public outcry, the court raised it to 140 hours because they're just so generous. Our Swedish courts should just spit into the faces of the victims instead, because it would save everyone's time and it would achieve pretty much the same effect. So how does the act of nearly beating a man to death receive justice through forcing some brats to work without pay for 3 hours twice a week? Well, according to this published background report from 2013 written by the National Board of Health and Welfare in Sweden, the risk for people who've been convicted at a young age include long-term unemployment, increased frequency in criminal behavior, and to retard the progress of maturity, which very often causes young convicts to stop being psychotic, sadistic idiots. So as you can see here, our legal system is carried out through a state of damage control mode. It's not primarily about justice. Sugarcoating is the norm. Justice always comes second, damage control for the perpetrator comes first, and trying to crush someone's head by curb stomping that person is apparently just a phase that the convict will later grow away from. That would also explain why you would laugh when you just crushed someone's cheekbone, that all has to be just a lack of maturity, I'm sure of it. But I'm just a layman, and a violent assault is, among minors, in fact, not a crystal clear indication that the person will become a repeat offender. There is a clear indication, on the other hand, between being convicted at a young age and continuing to commit crimes. So, yet again, we just return to the argument of early damage control. There is an age versus crime ratio, which is directly influenced by the point of contact with the legal system, and there is an evening out of this ratio that is around 25 years of age for a woman and 35 for a man if previously convicted. One of the main ideas behind our lenient laws regarding the punishments of minors is that a violent offense is to be downplayed in order to not create a traumatic experience in the criminal's life, since it might then also increase the time it takes for him to mature and move away from a life in crime and to not become a repeat offender. So the whole reasoning behind this argument is that age is statistically shown to reduce the chance of committing crime, so it's all about the offender. Again. So what about the victim? I mean, something has to be seriously wrong with the system if you can get away with a slap on the wrist for almost killing a person. Well, here's where it gets really messed up. Apparently, the Swedish legal system regarding punishing minors is claimed to have become stricter. Around the 1980s, a minor being prosecuted for a crime in Sweden was handled by viewing the crime through the looking glass of the person's living conditions and social situation, which means that the focus lay on the factors which led to the crime. But now the center of attention is directed at the several different levels of severity of a crime, so your situation up to the point of the crime being committed is paid less attention to. Well, why are we then cuddling people who would, if they were adults, most likely have been sentenced to 2 years in prison for brutally assaulting someone? How much further up on the scale of severity can you go when you're talking about a beating like this? I mean, the next step is murder. Well, it turns out that the main reason behind these embarrassingly weak sentences is that minors are deemed to not be mature enough to be able to be held responsible for their own actions, and that's why, for instance, the onlookers in the gang didn't get sentenced. Because they were apparently all just way too young to understand that the brutal violence that was being practiced against this defenseless man would seriously hurt him. Okay, so that leaves us in this fucked up gray zone between not being able to properly punish criminals who could have easily killed someone and at the same time tried to achieve some kind of justice for the victim. You have this situation where a person has the physical strength, at least in numbers, to murder someone, but they still can't be held responsible for their own actions. So the man who got beaten to a pulp and is now living with permanent cerebral damage just has to deal with the fact that these little shits are getting away with nearly killing him. A lot of kind people that read about the case in the papers were so disgusted by the pathetic sentences given to these criminals that they started a fundraiser in order to give the man the money he deserved in damages. So the public basically had to do the job of the justice system. That, my friends, is the purest form of dysfunctionality. It also turns out that the Gothenburg District Court's leniency for the psychopaths that nearly killed this man didn't pay off in the end. Who could have known? We all thought that it was just a phase that they'd grow out of. The nanny damage control tactic failed royally, again, when one of the same perpetrators that had tried to beat this man to death in 2012 was last year involved in a shooting in Angered in Gothenburg where a 21-year-old got shot and was crippled from the waist down. The 21-year-old who got shot was close to dying several times and it was unclear if he'd live until the trial. Sounds familiar? I wonder how he will react to the people who shot him getting sentenced to having to work 3 hours without pay 2 times a week and having to go to meetings and talk about their feelings. I hope he never has to find out and that our courts start giving a shit about the victims of crimes in Sweden. If they had punished these sadists properly the first time for their extremely severe offenses, then maybe this man wouldn't be unable to walk today. And with proper sentencing, maybe people in the future won't need to pull together fundraisers in order to help those in need. Take care of yourself, because the Swedish justice system sure as hell won't.
En av initiativtagarna bakom insamlingen till brottsoffret 2012 är inte förvånad över att gärningsmannen återigen misstänks för brott.
Jag skulle skött det här från början. Jag skulle fått ett bra straff innan. Inte böttrappning i 4 veckor utan. Det skulle blivit... hade han fått detta tidigare så kanske det inte var hänt.